Great, thank you, Scott, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm delighted to be with you today and to introduce you to my colleague, Hardy Merriman, who is the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. Prior to that, he has spent at least a decade in the field of nonviolent resistance and nonviolent conflict, working with Gene Sharp and then later in his, at the ICNC in various capacities. The topic that Hardy is going to discuss today is one that I think has a lot of room for empirical growth. So for those of you who are here as researchers, I think it's worth noting a few of the key puzzles and unanswered questions that come up in the course of Hardy's talk. And for those of you who are here who work in a more applied or policy capacity, I think you'll see also a lot of areas where policy and practitioner communities can come together and try to solve some of the current challenges in this regard as well. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Hardy for his talk today. And after Hardy speaks for about 30 minutes, Scott will offer some brief discussant remarks, and then I'll turn it to you for question and answer, and I'll just keep the queue tally, and we'll go one by one. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Erica. It's really great to be at Prio, and I especially want to thank Scott Gates for setting this up. For the last 13 years now, I guess, I've been looking at nonviolent movements around the world that are struggling for human rights, freedom, and justice. And I have looked at movements from women's rights, labor rights, minority rights, anti-corruption movements, movements struggling for democracy, movements confronting states, movements confronting corporations, and a wide range of other ways or causes around which ordinary people organize themselves, unite, and mobilize to try to challenge power holders and hold them accountable. And the question I have come back to continually is a very simple one. Why do some movements succeed and why do others fail? And the emphasis that I've had in looking at those questions has been looking at strategy. What kind of choices and strategies work for different kind of movements in different contexts, and what kind of strategies have failed? And what kinds of cross-applicable best practices can be discerned by looking at movements in different time periods, different scales, different causes, to try to really develop from a social science perspective a view towards what works, what doesn't, and the particular contextual factors that can also influence that issue. Now today I'm going to talk not just about civil resistance movements in their local context, I'm also going to talk about the role of external actors. I think it's very important right now for the international community to have a conversation about what their role can or should be in terms of how they interact with, and in some cases might provide various forms of support or assistance to nonviolent movements. Is there in fact a right or even a responsibility for external actors to be able to stand with, in some way, nonviolent movements that are struggling against oppression and trying to get their human rights? I will argue that there is the potential for the development of a new norm or a new doctrine around the idea of a right to assist nonviolent civil resistance movements. Now, I certainly don't have all the answers. It's complex in terms of how a new norm or doctrine will be developed and implemented. But what I want to do today is lay down some key facts, put forward some thoughts on this idea, and generate conversation, and also welcome any of your feedback, ideas, thoughts you may have, criticisms, and so forth. Because again, I think it's a critically important topic, but one that can generate a lot of good and healthy constructive debate about the role of external actors and their limits, both what's legal and permissible as well as what's advisable. So my outline has 5 parts. I want to just start with how civil resistance works, a few slides about that so we're all on the same page, and just give a few examples of different movements from Gandhi in 1930 all the way to the present. Then if I want external actors to think critically about developing a new norm or doctrine, I really have to make the case strongly that civil resistance movements matter. That they're critical, actually, when we think about long-term peace, stability, violence reduction, and democratic sustainability, that you really can't talk about those things anymore without thinking about the role of grassroots civil resistance movements. So I'm going to have 4 points about why civil resistance really matters to everyone, even if there's not an active movement in your country. Then I want to talk about the backlash against civil resistance movements, or against civil society, or against democracy promotion. People call it different things. I make distinctions, obviously, between those three things, and I really call it a backlash against civil resistance because I feel like what we've been seeing increasingly among authoritarian governments and trying to repress civic space and organizing is actually a direct result of authoritarians taking note of the power of civil resistance movements, which have been increasing in the last few decades, and studying them and trying to discern best practices and mutual aid to make sure that they prevent movements from rising and repress them when they do. Erica's got really interesting research. From 2010 to 2013, there were more civil resistance movements in Erica's data set, which we can get into the parameters later of that, than in the entire decade of the 1990s. So the incidence is dramatically increasing. The success rate has gone up and up and up from about 1950 into 2000, 2010, and has started to decline. In addition, the amount of movements now being confronted with lethal force has increased. And so there's some really interesting, shifting, troubling trends that we're not quite sure right now. Is this reversion to the mean, or is this, the development of a new trend? I do think that the backlash against civil resistance, and we'll get into some of the particulars of how that looks in different places, is a clear factor in the declining success rate of civil resistance movements. That said, civil resistance movements are still, I would argue, one of the most effective, if not the most effective, means for ensuring human rights and long-term democratic stability. So, next question. Well, if authoritarian governments and some non-state actors have taken note of the power of civil resistance movements and are actively trying to repress those movements and really understand those movements, what about those who have sympathies with those movements that are struggling for human rights and democracy? What can or should their role be? Do they even really understand movements as well as, for example, those who are trying to repress them? I would argue, by and large, the international community of INGOs, members of multilateral institutions, states, and others who would be concerned potentially with the causes that movements are supporting have not had as coherent a response nearly as the authoritarian side. And there's confusion both about the legal limits of what they can do, the legal the advisability of what they can do, and even understanding, again, and part of what I'll get to in this presentation, how movements create change. Because I think it's important for people to understand the whole sort of model of change around grassroots movements in order to understand how do we potentially engage with them. Now, one of the main ways that authoritarian regimes and others try to delegitimize movements is by saying they're foreign-backed. These are foreign agents. And no one has ever given me any kind of compelling argument or proof for why millions of people in Ukraine or Egypt or any of the other places where we've seen civil resistance movements, why these people are somehow all controlled by some outside external actor. I find the claim ridiculous on its face. External actors, of course, try to influence movements. Do they control them? Absolutely not. Civil resistance is not an exported phenomenon or an imported phenomenon. And I think in my research of civil resistance movements, they are driven by local decisions, local people, and that is as it should be. External actors do not have a primary role to play in trying to create movements or advise movements or control movements. That said, I think international actors do have a role to play in listening to movements, engaging with different actors and listening to their needs, trying to figure out if there are ways of support which could be indirect, for example, the imposition of sanctions or pressure on a state to try to reduce repression or change behavior, or things as simple as sharing information, sharing contacts, being witnesses to demonstrations so that if repression happens, there are foreign observers. Simple things that external actors can do from different external sectors, INGO, state, multilateral, and so forth, that can be quite helpful. Movements are not externally driven, but that doesn't mean that external actors can't play some sort of constructive role in supporting them when they're responding to local needs. And then the last slide that I have for this presentation is If we're serious about developing a doctrine or norm around a right to assist, what are some of the issues that puts on the table for us? And I'll sort of close with that. Now, when I do a presentation, I always put more slides in than I have time for. So I actually have 90 slides, complete with like, if anyone asks about different forms of external support or guidelines or thoughts, I have slides for that. But I certainly don't want to try to compress 5 hours worth of stuff in an hour and 45-minute presentation. So please let your questions run wild or your comments later. So how civil resistance works. So civil resistance is based on the core idea that power in society comes from the consent and obedience of thousands or millions of ordinary people in society. That basically, if ordinary people have thousands or millions of sort of micro-obedience patterns every day. They obey traffic laws, they go to work on time, they go to school, they do their homework, they pay their taxes or they don't pay their taxes, they pay their utility bills, they invest their money in certain ways, they buy certain products, they obey certain social conventions or cultural conventions, observe certain holidays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that obedience and consent is not necessarily ongoing. Mechanics can stop repairing things, engineers can stop designing bridges, builders can stop building, mechanics can stop repairing, women can stop, or men can stop, going to work or start changing the way in which they raise their children. Children can stop going to school. Bankers can stop banking, or people can stop putting their money in banks. People can shift their buying patterns, and so on and so forth. And that when thousands or millions of ordinary people start to shift their consent and obedience patterns in strategic, systematic, and targeted ways, they can actually create quite a bit of leverage in those situations. And this sounds like a nice idea, and it did to me too when I first heard it, but it's actually a remarkably practical idea too. As Gene Sharp started to, and others have shown academically, as well as numerous case studies from Gandhi and further back, people actually operationalize this idea, and movements are able to unify, organize, mobilize, and target shifts in obedience in ways that actually can really shift oppressive behavior patterns and power dynamics in society. So when movements do that, they exert economic, political, and social pressure through a wide array of tactics: strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, mass demonstrations, and lots of other tactics that really we can't take a picture of. Small, simple things like shifting obedience patterns, refusing to pay bills, so forth. You can't take a picture of it. It doesn't make the front pages, but all these acts can be incredibly powerful when they're done by a movement in an organized way. So movements weaken authoritarian regimes, or, for example, if they're attempting to hold corporations or non-state entities accountable, it's not always dissimilar, but I'll use authoritarian regimes to keep it a simple example here. By number one, reducing their legitimacy. Authoritarian regimes obviously depend on control of information streams as a way to try to frame and create reference points for people about why the authoritarian is good and in charge. And civil resistance movements disturb the peace. They call out the lie. These are terms that Václav Havel uses to describe part of what he was trying to do in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. They create other reference points. They break through sort of the propaganda or the media that has excluded certain views or prevented certain analyses. They also reduce legitimacy by showing that authoritarians cannot control everything all the time. One of the premises of authoritarian control is often, well, we create stability. We can control everything. And when movements reveal that that in fact is not true, that authoritarian power is actually somewhat fragile, this also reduces legitimacy. When legitimacy is reduced, at the same time, this can lead to reductions in capacities. Material resources, taxes, or products that people buy that benefit regime functionaries, people can choose to shift their money away from that. When people go on strike, they deny their labor. When people boycott, they deny their dollars or their various other forms of boycotts. And so this actually ultimately reduces capacities. If trains don't run and truckers don't truck, things don't ship. If buses don't run, people don't move. And so these are very real ways in which the capacities, which are often looked at as a fixed structure in a conflict, can actually shift over the course of a conflict when people start disobeying. The last point I'd make briefly is simply that movements can also create defections. And they can do this in a number of ways. For example, we have seen in many cases of civil resistance where you'll find members of the bureaucracy, members of the military and police forces, state-run media, judiciary, and so forth that start to shift, or corporations. And some may shift out of self-interest. Corporations may find that, in fact, it's no longer profitable to do business in a regime that is so oppressive, and start to feel that perhaps their bottom line is more important than propping up a corrupt elite, and start to shift under the pressure of a movement. Other people may shift because they truly believe something else is possible, and the movement has shown that another way is possible. Some people shift because their families join movements, and they start thinking, my kids are in this crowd. Perhaps I should start thinking differently about what I'm confronting. Whatever the reason, defections are widely documented sort of effect of civil resistance movements. Now, movements also strengthen populations in a few ways. They instill hope in a population by demonstrating that ordinary people have the power and that change is possible. A lot of people, fear, of course, is one reason why people may not do anything. But another reason people may not do anything to challenge a status quo is because they feel hopeless about it. People aren't necessarily afraid to take risks, but they really don't want to take risks if they feel that it's going to be futile and useless. And so movements start demonstrating that change is possible, first in small things, and as people watch and see that change is possible in small things, that demonstration effect is very powerful and starts to shift the psychology around perhaps our shifting consent will create a form of power for us, and perhaps we can use that to change larger things. They unify and mobilize a population. Obviously, it's divide and rule is a classic tool of oppression, and movements often have to bridge social distance between people of different genders, ethnicities, social classes, urban-rural divides, and so forth to unify people. And they build alternative institutions and decentralize power in society, critically important in terms of creating sustainable democratic outcomes. And because movements are very participatory, lots of people can be involved, young and old, men and women, urban, rural, and so forth. They create lots of participation in society from different sectors. Many people who didn't think of themselves as terribly political before become politically involved. And this starts to decentralize power, again, which tends to bode well for democratic transitions. So examples, just quickly, we can look at Gandhi. My country, the United States, has a great history of nonviolent movements. This is a women's suffrage movement in 1920. It actually was like a 50-year movement that got women the right to vote in the United States. U.S. labor movement. And it's funny, when I learned U.S. history, I didn't learn about these movements as key contributors to things that make the United States, that have made my life better. This was not part of how I learned U.S. history. But U.S. has a great history of movements. It's just not often told. Civil rights movement we know about. Other movements, the anti-apartheid movement, particularly during the phase of the 1980s, lots of mass nonviolent resistance as part of the United Democratic Front. Solidarność in Poland. This here is a demonstration in Bolivia against the US corporation Bechtel, which privatized, the government allowed Bechtel to privatize water in Cochabamba, the second largest city of Bolivia, so that it was even illegal for Bolivians to harvest their own rainwater, because even before it hit the ground, Bechtel owned it. And Bolivians organized and changed that. This is anti-corruption movement in Korea. These people are all holding red cards, like as if they're at a football match, and they're yelling out the names of corrupt politicians. And every time they yell it, people throw up the red card and say, "Out!" And this was an incredibly successful movement, actually, detailed in this book, which I'll talk later about, Curtailing Corruption. Serbia, the Otpor movement. Pakistan, the Lawyers movement against US-backed military dictatorship of Pervez Musharraf. Burma, the Saffron Revolution. Egypt, 2011. This is obviously like, I'm skipping hundreds of movements, just to throw a few different highlights from different parts of the world. But you get the point. And obviously not all have, some have been effective, as Egypt was, in terms of challenging an authoritarian, but not necessarily getting a democratic consolidation. Others failed to successfully change the authoritarian at the time, but may have had other effects that led to constructive changes later on, and so forth. But quite a few have succeeded. So why should external actors care about this? If there's a civil resistance movement in a given country, and I'm not from that country, and it doesn't seem geostrategically important to me or whatever, why should I care? Well, there are a few reasons. Number one, civil resistance movements are a major force in ending oppressive rule. And so we have here the great work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In their work, looking at 323 cases of violent and nonviolent campaigns over about 100 years, 1900 to 2006, confronting major regimes, trying to get major goals, either the end of foreign occupation, self-determination, or the end of a dictatorship. They found a 53% success rate for civil resistance, nonviolent challenges of regimes, versus 26% for violence. So it's much more effective than most people think at ending oppressive rule. And here you see a chart with blue being success rate, blue being civil resistance, red being violence, and there you see the different success rates for Erica's data set. And one interesting question we can talk about is how this data set goes to, again, 2006, and how things have changed in the last 10 years somewhat. We can get into that in Q&A. And here is by decade. Blue is, you see the increasing impact of civil resistance. Actually, this bar goes up beyond the caption there at the top. I think it's close to 70%, this blue bar. Number two, not only are they very effective at challenging oppressive rule, but they're remarkable at yielding democratic consolidation. When we consider how challenging it is to transition from dictatorship to democracy, because when a transition happens, there's frequently a state that is not ready for free elections, doesn't have free media, doesn't have laws on the books that can change things. They can quickly be changed necessarily, may have endemic corruption issues, and so forth. Democratic change and consolidation is always challenging, incredibly challenging, and yet civil resistance movements, in spite of that, have had a remarkable impact. So looking at, again, Erica's data from the NAVCO data set, we look at 5 years after a successful civil resistance campaign, and we see a 57% success rate of democratic consolidation versus 6% success rate of democratic consolidation for violent campaigns. So we're looking at about a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of effectiveness of sustaining a democratic change. What's interesting as well is look at failed campaigns. Here, failed civil resistance campaigns, 5 years after they failed, still result in a 35% chance of a democratic outcome in 5 years. So they don't just necessarily create an immediate transition, they create collateral effects. They decentralize power that can create democratic development later on. There's another study as well that came out before Erica did her research, which was put out by the organization Freedom House. My organization, ICNC, also worked on this study. And it looked at 67 transitions from authoritarian governments from 1970 to 2005. And I won't go through all the statistics. It's a free study. You can download it online. But just briefly, they found that 75% of the transitions that they studied, they determined nonviolent civic resistance, as they termed it, was a, quote, key factor driving those transitions. And they also found that transitions that were led by nonviolent civic resistance had the greatest democratic gains of any other means. So what other means did they look at? They looked at top-down transitions. They looked at transitions where elites got together perhaps for a peace accord or just decided they wanted to change things without significant grassroots pressure. And they looked at how those transitions did, and they found, what was it, a 14% success rate? Oh, 3 were free, so 21% success rate for top-down driven transitions. And then interestingly, they looked at, well, what happens when there's only regime violence but no violence by the civil resistance movement? And they still found a 60% democratic outcome. But when the civil resistance movement starts engaging in violence, the democratic outcome drops to 20%. So it's not the incidence of violence that is key determinant, it's the opposition, is the movement engaging in violence that really drops the percentage of a democratic outcome. And here is a chart to show this. So blue is transitions driven by civil resistance. Red is driven by elites and top-down initiatives. And then whatever this is, yellow-green, is driven by civil resistance mixed with violence. And you can see the outcomes: free, partly free, not free, in terms of the states in which those transitions happened. I think I'm actually going to skip this slide for now and go to the next one. There's another critical factor here that I think is emerging, and actually for those of you who are doing research, I would love to see more research on this topic. I would argue that civil resistance are really powerful at starting to curb corruption and making progress against corruption. That bottom-up civil resistance-driven initiatives can do remarkable things to try to correct corruption that top-down initiatives alone cannot address. And so it's been increasingly evident over the last 5-10 years that civilian-based efforts are critical in dealing with corruption. So in the International Anti-Corruption Conference in 2010, one of their closing statements, sort of in this final summary, was empowered people create change. This expanded element of our conference points the way for the future of the anti-corruption movement, one incorporating citizen mobilization and empowerment, as well as the inclusion of youth. So the broader corruption community, as represented in that conference, in 2010 is laying down a marker saying this is the future, is trying to get civilians engaged in this. By the next time, 2012, their entire conference was called Mobilizing People, Connecting Agents of Change, seeing again that top-down initiatives alone cannot curb corruption. We see in Transparency International's Strategy 2015 plan, which had 6 points, one of the key points was increased empowerment of people and partners around the world to take action against corruption. The challenge is to engage with people more widely than ever before, for ultimately only people can stop corruption. We even see at the World Bank making statements recognizing that people have to be active agents of change in addressing corruption in their countries. And there's a great book, which I'm going to plug for a second, by my colleague Shaska Byerly that, again, my organization supported. She looked at 16 campaigns, nonviolent campaigns, addressing corruption around the world. Everything from that campaign in Korea that I mentioned to you a second ago, to what Sicilians have done to try to take on the mafia and actually successfully curb the mafia. So corruption by non-state actors and state actors. It's a remarkable set of case studies. She ultimately, I think 12 made it into this book of the 16 that she researched. And I think there's a lot more good work that can be done about it. And her point isn't that it's just bottom up. It's bottom up and top down is much more effective when you have bottom up pressure as well. And then lastly, if you look at overturning oppression, if you look at democratic development and consolidation, and if you look at curbing corruption, what you're really looking at is a force that has the potential to lead to long-term democratic stability, peace, and reduction of violence, because it can reduce some of the core drivers of instability and violence. So it can reduce conditions that lead to inter and interstate wars, reduce potential for humanitarian public health crises, increase long-term peace and stability. I'm not a great artist, as you can see, but here's my sort of network of interlinking root causes, and I would argue not that civil resistance is the answer, but it's a critical part of the answer to dealing with a lot of these interlinked root causes that are very challenging to transform. So that's my pitch, part of my pitch about why movements really matter and why they have very long-term implications that I think all actors concerned with the world, the state of the world, and creating a world that's better for people really need to pay attention to. Now let's talk about the backlash for a second. It's fairly well known what some of the sort of aspects of the backlash are, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but only to sort of say there are very active efforts being taken to limit and shape civil society and various authoritarian regimes, as we know, everything from funding restrictions to registration restrictions to shutting them down, kicking them out of the country, claiming that if they take even $1 from external sources that they're foreign agents and so forth. But it's not even so much the funding restrictions that I'm concerned with, it's really a lot of the other stuff and just simple repression. Tight management of electoral processes, labeling civil society and any dissent as externally backed foreign agents. This is one of the key things that any external group that might engage with the movement has to think about, is whether it plays into that narrative. On the other hand, many movements that have not been externally backed at all have still been labeled foreign agents because regimes do it anyway, no matter what. So that's also true. Advocating a discourse of hyper-sovereignty, we'll get into that later. Basically, the authoritarian argument that anything anything that external actors want to do, stop at my borders. And sort of corollary to that, some of those who argue most aggressively that they have total sovereignty and can stop anything at their borders have no problem with their governments getting all kinds of corporate assistance and assistance from other governments. They have no problem with their business community getting all kinds of external foreign investment and everything else. But when civil society gets any kind of contact at all, oh no, we can't let that happen. So there's already quite a double standard there with how they look at those things. Sharing best practices with other authoritarian regimes, I think this is going on quite a bit. Through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one example where there have been sort of indications that has happened as well as probably informally among a lot of other regimes. Providing political, economic, military, and technical support to regimes, confronting nonviolent challenges. You see it in votes in the UN. You see it in making emergency loans when movements are challenging the economy of a particular regime, or certainly in lending security advice or actually security personnel. Controlling information streams, both trying to keep information out that might be useful to grassroots actors, as well as more broadly simply constricting free flow of information. Labeling nonviolent resistance as terrorism, which this isn't even just something that authoritarian governments do. Some democratic governments don't have it on the books, is my understanding, that terrorism is by definition violent. There's a little hole in the definition of terrorism that might even allow nonviolent acts to be conceived of as terrorist, which is worrying and troublesome. Sharing information and monitoring technology, and direct military intervention, as we've seen in Ukraine and with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. So these are some elements of the backlash, and it keeps continuing. I mean, authoritarians aren't resting on their laurels. They're actively continuing to find new ways. I'll give you an example. There are now anti-Maidan groups, my understanding is what I've heard, is there are anti-Maidan groups in Russia, groups of ordinary citizens that are being sort of cultivated by the government to specifically try to counter any kind of nonviolent protest that happens. So while this represents part of the playbook keeps changing and progressing. And again, the question is, for those who are sympathetic to movements, if this is the status quo, what can external actors do to have a more sort of clear approach to pushing back against some of this? Because really, when you boil it down, the two core principles around which a lot of this authoritarian backlash is wrapped, that they wrap around, this sort of two core principles, is what I call NR2NR, no right to nonviolent resistance. And then NR2A, no right to assist. And although these norms haven't been articulated like that, they're not norms, but I believe that there is a concerted effort to try to create these as international norms through repeating them so much, through practice, that functionally people start to believe civil resistance, well, that's not necessarily protected by international human rights law, and we as external actors, we can't really do anything about it. These are sort of de facto norms that are being pushed consistently. And this is why I think it's so critical for the international community to start to answer these and say, wait a minute. So is there a right or responsibility to assist? Well, we certainly know that through international treaties there are rights of assembly, association, conscience, expression, and various political participation rights that are guaranteed under widely recognized treaties. We know that there are UN General Assembly resolutions that reaffirm these rights. We know that there are international institutions that are supposed to monitor these treaties that also issue statements that have some legal power reasserting this. And I'll just give you a few quotes. This is a quote from Mina Kiai, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The right to freedom of association not only includes the ability of individuals or legal entities to form and join an association, but also to seek, receive, and use resources, human, material, and financial, from domestic, foreign, and international sources. So I don't just have a right to associate with you, you have a right to associate with me. The right of association means nothing if I can associate with anyone, but no one has the right to associate with me. Here is some commentary from legal scholar Elizabeth Wilson, who recently wrote a really interesting chapter in, let's see if I have it, this book. Is Authoritarianism Staging a Comeback? And Elizabeth Wilson started to think through what some of the legal case would be for A, why civil resistance is protected under international law, and why certain forms of assistance in certain contexts is also arguably protected by international law. So she starts to lay out the case in a chapter in this book, and here are some quotes. The primary right to engage in nonviolent protest implicates political participation rights, the rights to opinion, information, and expression, the rights of peaceful assembly and association. So these rights receive expression and to some extent are enforced by nonviolent actors on the ground. The right to receive information is transitive, meaning it goes both ways with respect to the right to impart information. If I can receive information, you have a right to impart it to me. The right to associate with those willing to provide support is transitive, goes both ways with the right to associate with those who wish to receive support. Nonviolent actors are protected by the right of self-determination, the right of peaceful assembly, and various political participation rights. And I am not a legal scholar, and I hope some of you are and can provide some incisive commentary. But even if not, I think this is also a legal argument that needs to be had further. I'm not saying it's a clear-cut case necessarily, but there are certainly points to push up against this no right to civil resistance, no right to assist case that is being made that I would argue has far fewer legal bases. And so Elizabeth Wilson here talks about various political participation rights, such as in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1, all people have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Civil resistance could be seen as an expression of that right or as guaranteeing that right. Article 25, every citizen shall have the right and opportunity to take part in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives, and to vote and be elected to a genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and so on and so forth. And so again, you can see civil resistance less necessarily, in this case, less as a pure expression of those rights, but more as a guarantor of those rights. Now, what about the counter-arguments, the norm of non-intervention? What about violations of sovereignty? Those are legitimate concerns. But they're certainly not the sort of case closed, end of conversation kind of concerns that a lot of authoritarian states would have you believe. So non-intervention was codified in the UN Charter as prohibiting the threat or use of force against another member state. So it doesn't, at least in the UN Charter, to my understanding, outlaw nonviolent forms, for example, information exchange. There are other places where the idea of non-intervention is more broadly construed. So the question is what forms of intervention, obviously, are legitimate or not legitimate, but at least in terms of how it was enshrined in the UN Charter, it was about violence. And the reason for non-intervention is because, and this is repeated again and again and again, people have a right to self-determination. They have a right to determine the way that they will develop in their state. Now here's the question. If people are being oppressed, repressed, not allowed to have any representation, there are dictators for life, elections are rigged, how are people free to actually exercise their right of self-determination? They're not. And if they're not, then it can be argued that actually assistance to those people to exercise that right of self-determination is actually legitimate. It's in direct keeping with support for self-determination, that people should find the means to determine their way when domestically they're prevented from doing so. Another point is that sovereignty resides in a population, not necessarily the head of state. So the state is the population of the state. The government is a particular head of state. And if that head of state doesn't claim or doesn't get the ability to claim sovereignty through periodic elections or other processes that show that they represent the will of the people, should they be allowed actually then to assert sovereignty as the legitimate representative of the people? And then, of course, international human rights law, and we talked about this, and treaties make sovereign assertions flexible. So assertions of hyper-sovereignty, if we really take those to the limit, that makes a lot of human rights law pretty obsolete, doesn't it? Because you really can't do anything to enforce it if it goes over a border. And we know that that's not the case. We know that actually, some have argued that actually as a regime becomes more violent against nonviolent challenges, that can trigger escalating levels of intervention and make sovereignty less and less and less of a powerful argument against it. And then, of course, there are contradictions in practice. Some of the states that are most concerned about sovereignty are the ones that regularly violate the sovereignty of other countries through military invasion or other affairs. And one of the bases of international law is not just treaties, it's customary international law, which basically means established through practice. So if we look at practice, I mean, there are all kinds of contradictions in terms of what the law says about what sovereignty says can and can't be done and what states are actually doing. So considerations in developing a right to assist. This is a very sort of challenging topic to think about with regards to how a doctrine could be developed. There are a lot of issues that come forth. And again, I simply want to put it forward for conversation and welcome ideas, thoughts, and feedback that you might have, because I don't have the full case here. I just think it's a conversation we need to engage in. So here are some big issues that I see. So what forms of assistance would be permissible under what circumstances? Who would provide various forms of assistance? Who could receive various forms of assistance? Is it a right to assist or a responsibility to assist? We have, of course, the idea of responsibility to protect, which binds states to do certain things. Of course, it's fairly different from what I'm proposing in R2A in terms of when it would be triggered and certainly in terms of the kinds of action it would trigger. So that's sort of where the similarities end, is just in the name. But is it a right or responsibility to assist? Would R2A be formally invoked? Is this something that actually, is there a body in which this gets formally provoked, or is it sort of a norm that starts to get cited and established through precedent? Would new institutions need to be created to operationalize R2A? And what would be the process of establishing it? And then furthermore, I guess another point would simply be, even once it's clarified what the law would allow, what's really advisable? And this is a critical question, because I do think there are so many ways that external support can be done that is damaging. For a long time, this is actually a topic that I didn't really want to talk about much, because I was much more interested intellectually and also felt it was much more appropriate to put all my emphasis on the role of ordinary people in their society challenging oppression, because they are the drivers of movements. And that is where a lot of the focus should be. But in light of what I've seen in terms of this extreme backlash, again, this is the conversation that's time has come. There are a lot of ways in which external support can be done poorly, but there are some simple things that external supporters can do when they listen and engage and try to discern local needs that might be helpful. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.